Welcome to Story Behind the Stone, where we talk service, sacrifice, and stories, connecting you with the most interesting people in the field of history and commemoration. My name is Ryan Mullens, along with Matthew Cudmore. We are with Memory Anchor, a company changing the way the world remembers with technology.
Ryan, really enjoyed sitting down the other day with Ultan Moran with the Dublin Cemeteries Trust and Glasnevin National Cemetery in Ireland. It really is a fascinating cemetery. They're celebrating in a few years' time their 200th anniversary. The story of Ireland is buried there. The story of Dublin is there. I really enjoyed speaking with him about all of the historical figures, unique architectural details, and, over 1.5 million burials across their 5 properties. There was a lot to talk about. I really enjoyed speaking with him. I hope listeners enjoy every minute of it. Take a listen.
Okay, welcome to the show where we talk service, sacrifice, and stories. My name is Ryan, along with co-host Matthew. We are with Memory Anchor, a company committed to using technology for good. Today, we are talking with Ultan with Glasnevin Cemetery. Ultan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
It is a real pleasure, Ultan. Thank you for joining the show. And we have lots to talk about. I think lots of ground to cover. Would love just to hear a little bit about you and how you got interested in this space, and maybe a little bit about what a typical day-to-day looks like and how many steps you get, because we were chatting before about how many miles and how many pairs of shoes you're going through these days.
Yeah, cool. So, well, I began here in Glasnevin Cemetery back in 2018. I had a background in Irish history, again, having studied it in college. But the thing about Glasnevin Cemetery is that there are 1.5 million people buried here. And of that number, we have a huge amount of people who shaped Irish history buried here. And so over the years, since the cemetery was first established in 1832, it became known as the national cemetery of the country. So a lot of those who shaped Irish history, who, fought during our War of Independence, for example, but people from all religions and none as well, people who, from all walks of life were buried in this one cemetery. And so I always had great interest in Irish history. And so this was a place I always was, very interested in working. So, as I say, after I graduated college, I began here working on the front desk in the museum that we have in the cemetery. And then eventually I started doing tours of the cemetery too. And then once we returned after COVID, of course, during which we were closed here in the visitor center, we didn't do any guided tours of the cemetery. But once we reopened back in 2021, I began working a bit more when it came to research, helping people find graves in the cemetery, which, as you can imagine, if there's 1.5 million people buried here, we always get people in every day, try to find loved ones buried in the cemetery, doing a bit of historical research with the archives that we have here as well. And then I also took on the social media role. So I run the social media for the cemetery, which would largely focus on sharing the stories of the cemetery with the public. So on any given day, it's quite a lot of, different roles, which I like, so it keeps things interesting, I suppose, even though it is already an incredibly interesting place to work. But as you say, it requires a lot of walking around the place. The cemetery is 140 acres in size. So, it keeps my step count up on any given day.
It is massive. And I think that the cemetery has such a connection to Dublin and the country's history. If you can give some context kind of on Cemetery Trust and kind of the associated properties, and then would love to hear just kind of what people are looking for when they visit, in particular at Glasnevin.
Cool. So, well, the cemetery itself was first established by the man actually in the portrait there behind me, Daniel O'Connell, who was known here in Ireland as the Liberator, because he advocated through peaceful means for Catholic emancipation, essentially granting Catholics more rights, which were denied beforehand under a restrictive series of laws known as the penal laws, which essentially forbade Catholics from entering Parliament to effect change. Property rights were curtailed, education rights, but also, importantly for the cemetery, the right of a dignified burial. So Catholics in Ireland, but also Protestants who weren't part of the established church, they were denied the right of a dignified burial. Oftentimes they were buried in, churchyards under dead of night, for example. And so O'Connell came along and he advocated for the establishment of a cemetery for people to be buried regardless of their religion. So again, in Ireland, that was an incredibly radical idea in those days, to have a cemetery where Catholics could be buried right next to Protestants. O'Connell believed very much in equality in life, but also, importantly, equality in death as well. So the cemetery itself, once the Catholic emancipation was granted, a trust was established by O'Connell committee, which ultimately established a small cemetery not too far away from where I am now, called Golden Bridge Cemetery, which was the first non-denominational cemetery in Ireland, but it was only an acre in size. And so it quickly became apparent, due to the demand of burial space here in Dublin, that a larger cemetery would need to open. And so Glasnevin first opened 1832 and quickly grew from what was originally 9 acres in size to what's now 140 acres in size. And from, quite humble origins, now 1.5 million people are laid to rest here. And as I say, because so many people are buried here, on any given day, we have people coming in from all around Ireland trying to locate family members who might be buried here. But because so many historical figures were buried in the cemetery as well, we get tourists from all over the world coming to Glasnevin to, get a little brief on Irish history, I suppose, because you can really tell the story of the last 2 centuries of Irish history from this one cemetery.
One of the things we're often saying is there is the history of the city is really being told in the stories of these individuals and their lives, which is often not captured in just a headstone and a name by itself. Right. I imagine that your cemetery would bring in a lot of visitors, as you have probably some pretty prominent individuals there. And if Matt and I were coming out to visit, say, what would be some of the headstones you would be taking us immediately to? Some of those highlighted headstones.
Well, a couple come to mind. The first one is actually Daniel O'Connell's headstone, because when I say a headstone, I'm underselling it a bit. It's a 55-meter tall round tower that was built over his crypt. And that's the other thing. He isn't buried beneath the ground. He's placed in a very ornate crypt, so you can actually see his coffin. And his coffin is topped with black Kilkenny marble, which has been used particularly over in England to cover the grave of a monarch. And so although O'Connell wasn't a king, he had no desire to be one, he was still seen as the leader of the country. And so once he died in 1847, he actually died in Italy, but he made a dying wish. He said he wanted his body to be, brought to Ireland, his heart to be sent to Rome, and then his soul sent up to heaven. So they took him literally. They, removed his heart and they, placed his heart in a place called the Irish College in Rome, which is where Irish men went off to become priests back in the day. But his body was brought here. Eventually it was moved beneath the round tower, which, as I say, is 55 meters tall, and it's technically his headstone. So Dublin is quite a low-lying city. We don't have many skyscrapers, any skyscrapers, I suppose, or tall buildings. The O'Connell Tower, built in 1855, is still one of the tallest structures in Dublin, right here in the cemetery. And people can climb it all the way up to the top, 198 steps, to get the views. So that's probably the most impressive headstone that we have in the cemetery, I think it's fair to say. It is based on old Irish Christian architecture, the round towers that you'll often see in monasteries across the country, dating back 1,000 years. We did cheat in that we built ours about 1,000 years after all of the other ones, which is why it's the tallest in Ireland. But that one in particular, of course, it tells the story of O'Connell. He was a great figure in Ireland, of course, but he was also a well-known historical figure around the world too. He advocated for equal rights for all people, regardless of their, background, their race, their creed. He was a very good friend, for example, of Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist of the United States, who, as a young man, when he was 27, not long after he published his famous autobiography, giving his experience as a slave, he arrived in Ireland for what was going to be maybe a few days visit on the way to Britain, but he loved it so much that he actually spent 2 months here. And during his time here, he listened to O'Connell speak about slavery in the US. He denounced it, and the two became very, very close. And Douglas, because O'Connell would always use peaceful protest to effect change, O'Connell would prove to be a inspiration for him. O'Connell was already reaching the end of his life at that point. But that's the story I really enjoy telling, kind of drawing in the international influence, I suppose, of Daniel O'Connell, the founder of Glasnevin Cemetery. When it comes to a typical sort of headstone, probably the most visited graves that we have here in Glasnevin Cemetery is a grave not too far away from where I'm now standing or sitting, that of Michael Collins, who was the leader, I suppose, of Ireland's War of Independence against Britain. A lot of public interest in Michael Collins. He's a very famous name here in Ireland because, well, everyone would learn about him in school, I suppose, but he became very well known overseas because there was a movie made about him in the 90s, starring Liam Neeson as Michael Collins. So he's quite a romantic figure in Irish history. The Irish War of Independence, it ended with quite a controversial truce. And that truce ultimately led to civil war between, people who would have been allies just a few months before. And Collins was killed not too long after that civil war began in 1922. So, and he was only 31 when he died. So he's a very romantic figure in Irish history. Valentine's Day, for example, his grave is always covered with balloons and chocolates and flowers and all of that. So he's probably the most visited grave that we have here. We do actually have, there's a lady in New York who fell in love with Michael Collins, and she sends flowers over throughout the year. No Irish connections whatsoever, but she fell in love with the story of Michael Collins, sends flowers over. And then there's also a mysterious French lady as well with no Irish connections who, again, from afar fell in love with Michael Collins a century or so, well, not quite a century, but many, many, many decades after his death, and, sends flowers over to him throughout the year as well. So very popular man. We'd all be doing well to get that level of attention on Valentine's Day a century after our death. But there you are.
Alton, speaking of New York City, you were just there, if I understand correctly, just the other week.
I was, yeah.
And you visited, I think, Greenwood Cemetery. Is that right? What as a working cemetery professional, what do you like to do when you visit such a historic cemetery in another place like that? Like, what did you get up to? I'm really curious.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you say that because I imagine others who work in other cemeteries around the world, the first thing they do when they go abroad is probably visit a cemetery, which is maybe slightly unusual to those who aren't working in cemeteries. But I think it is a great way to, as you mentioned, understand the history of a city or, a country is to visit a cemetery. You really get a great feel for the history and the culture of a country based on its cemeteries of, where people were laid to rest. And so, as I say, there were connections between Glasnevin and Greenwood Cemetery. So I was kind of put in contact with the people who worked there. An amazing, amazing place. It was covered in snow when I visited, so very scenic. And there was, actually when I was in college, I focused on US history. So, in particular, the Roosevelt family. And so many members of the Roosevelt family were buried in Greenwood Cemetery. So I visited their grave, visited a couple of the graves of those with Irish connections as well. So it is always interesting, when you go overseas to kind of find these connections to your own country. Yeah. So, and also, a couple of us from Glasnevin went off to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Very famous, beautiful cemetery. Oscar Wilde is buried there. We tended to export our best and brightest, sadly. So Oscar Wilde is buried in Paris. James Joyce is buried in Zurich in Switzerland. I haven't been to his grave yet. Though his parents are buried here, James Joyce. So we do have that family connection to him. So whenever I go overseas, one of the first things I do is always go to the local cemetery. Yeah.
Do you have any cemeteries on a bucket list for you? If you could go anywhere in the world, where would you be heading?
Good question. I would have said, Highgate in London, I suppose. I've been there once, but it was kind of a flying visit. I'd love to spend a bit more time there. My visit there was amazing. It's, I kind of like a cemetery when it's overgrown, kind of, but managed in a way. Highgate was a bit like that. Père Lachaise is quite like that as well. Central Cemetery in Vienna would be quite nice to visit. So yeah, I have a couple of them on my bucket list, I suppose. Me and a couple of the other guys from the cemetery tend to, put it on our bucket list whenever we head off. So yeah, so there you go.
Got a few on my list. I know when I go to some of these different cemeteries, I think Halifax was one that I was really interested in, and there's people who were on the Titanic. A lot of them were buried there, so it was interesting to go through there. But one of the things I really enjoy about going into these cemeteries is trying to find the unique little features that you don't see in other cemeteries. I mean, obviously that tower is a unique feature of your cemetery, but when you think of some of the lesser known or more subtle details, is there anything that sticks out for you?
Yes. So the cemetery is laid out in such a way where a lot of the older graves are clustered in one particular area. The original 9 acres, I suppose. And around that area, you'll notice a lot of very unique monuments and headstones. One in particular is that of not even necessarily a famous figure. It was a lady who died of cholera, or we reckon cholera or typhus, so one of these diseases which really would have impacted Dublin quite a lot back in the 19th century. And her resting place, her headstone, on the back of it, there's a skull and crossbones, which is quite a intense thing to see. The headstone, I suppose, if you're just wandering around. But there's also a little poem, which, and if off the top of my head, it's something like, "Here Anne doth be dissolved to dust, and so must you and I," which is again slightly morbid, I suppose. But it was a little poem written on the back of a headstone back in 1832, which is a bit difficult to spot. It's kind of clustered in the middle of in quite a lot of headstones. But that's kind of what I like, just exploring the very oldest part of the cemetery and happening upon these very unique monuments. And I suppose it would all harken back to an idea quite popular back in Victorian times, that of memento mori, remember death. So essentially, if somebody was visiting a headstone and they saw a symbol like that, the skull and crossbones, they would be reminded to live a good life, because you never know what's going to be waiting for you on the other side. So, so things like that are quite interesting, the kind of symbolism that you'll spot in the cemetery, particularly in the areas dating back to the 19th century. After that, there was quite a lot of, I suppose, headstones became quite standardized in a lot of ways. Of course, there would be exceptions every now and then, but you can really tell the evolution of headstones as well, particularly the older part of the cemetery dating back to the 1830s. You'll notice a lot of obelisks and monuments taking inspiration from ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt. And then gradually, as the decades went on, particularly here in Ireland, there was a cultural movement called Celtic Revival, which looked into Irish history, I suppose, for inspiration. And so that's where the famous Celtic cross would come from. The kind of the cross with a circle in the middle of it. And so Glasnevin has the largest collection of Celtic crosses anywhere in the world. Nobody has ever counted, but it's a lot anyway. And a lot of different debate on what that would represent. Usually people would say that it would date back to when Christianity was first being brought to Ireland. Of course, most Irish people back then were pagan, worshipped the sun, and that's what the circle in the middle of the cross would represent, kind of merging the two faiths together. But, that's what it is nice kind of seeing that evolution of headstones down through the decades.
Yeah, as you're saying that, Matt and I have had a lot of opportunity to go to Canada's National Cemetery, Beechwood, and that's in Ottawa. And you'll see a lot of these, spanning, early 1800s, you'll see like those obelisks. It's something you would think you would see in Egypt, to some of these Celtic crosses. And it's such a unique thing. And then more modern, we're seeing a lot of granite with etched pictures, like laser inscribed pictures, people trying to preserve the image and tell a bit of a story and such.
Yeah.
And I guess you as you're talking about that inscription and that the family inscription, that it's really interesting because headstones you have a very small bit of real estate on a headstone, and the family or the individual is trying to communicate a story or there's something there. And I find those inscriptions, we see a lot of them on war graves, is, they're quite heart-wrenching
Yeah.
and such. Any inscriptions that you've seen that have really captured you?
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, particularly in that oldest part of the cemetery, there's actually quite a lot of slabs, just quite simple when it comes to the shape of the headstone. But in fact, the oldest grave in the cemetery, well, the oldest headstone, not the oldest burial, but the oldest standing headstone states that it's the oldest standing headstone in the cemetery, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Campbell. But of course, it's limited real estate until, well, you can actually put on a headstone, but they really put a lot on their headstone, so they must have used as small a font as possible, so you have to really look in. And of course, it dates to 1832, so it's a bit faded at this point. But you can still make out like the family put the address, particularly when we get visitors from overseas. Quite an unusual thing. Quite common here in Ireland for on a headstone, not only to have the details about the person, where, what age they were when they died, for example. That's quite standard. But the address where the family lived is often recorded as well.
No.
So if somebody lived in quite a nice area, I suppose it was a way of bragging that, oh yes, we lived on this lovely street and in a very big house. So we do get quite a lot of things like that. When it comes to inscriptions, I suppose a lot of people in the 19th century, of course, life expectancy was so short, and so it's a bit shocking when you walk around down there seeing the age of people when they were dying. People who were young kids, for example, people in their 20s. You very rarely see anyone with age 70 or age 60 even, with these headstones dating back to the 19th century, when there's so many different, cholera, of course, spread like wildfire throughout Dublin. There are, many hundreds of thousands of standing headstones in Glasnevin, but the majority of that 1.5 million I mentioned are completely unmarked. So they could be buried in a grave that people would walk right past without realizing. But then there are also, as I mentioned, cholera there. There's a particular man named Charles Stewart Parnell who was a parliamentarian, for example. He was kind of the leader of Ireland during the after O'Connell's time in the second half of the 19th century. And before he died, he wanted to be buried with the common people. So he was buried in a plot which contains the remains of around 11,000 victims of a previous cholera epidemic going back to the 1840s and 50s. And it's quite a small area as well. It's not a huge sprawling area. It's quite a small little circular plot. And yet 11,000 people, the population of an entire town, are buried in that one area, which is always kind of difficult to wrap your head around. But the cemetery was always quite meticulous in the fact that every single burial that ever took place here, be it Daniel O'Connell buried beneath a 55-metre tall round tower, or somebody whose grave is unmarked who died of cholera, the cemetery still recorded their burial. So that went from 1832 all the way up to the present day. So that record is still maintained. So that's, a great historical resource that we have in the cemetery. And in many ways, particularly for those who died in the 19th century, one little line in our record book might be the one reminder that we have of a life lived. So it's an incredibly important resource that we have here.
Do you get quite a few visitors that are coming in that are trying to, trace their roots, their genealogy?
Yeah, so the records are all digitized now. So people can do their own research on our website, but then it's always great when they actually come into the cemetery as well. Mm-hmm. The cemetery is laid out into a big grid reference system, so we know exactly where each and every burial took place. So because the system is all digitized now, we can tell exactly how many people are buried here with particular names, how many people have a particular occupation, a particular cause of death, which is always quite interesting doing research on that. Only 3 Ultans buried in Glasnevin, funnily enough. My surname is Moran, Moran, and there are 6,000 Morans buried here. The most common surname is Byrne, Byrne. There's 23,000 Byrnes buried here.
Oh, wow.
So it's always interesting when we get visitors from overseas, expecting to find one Byrne family plot when there's 11 or, over 20,000 of them buried throughout the place. But yeah, so when it comes to interesting stories, I mean, I remember speaking, you mentioned, the victims of Titanic buried at Halifax, isn't that right? I had about 2 years ago now, Titanic researchers who put together this online map of memorials around the world for victims of Titanic. And they were looking for a memorial here in Dublin, a headstone that they saw somewhere, and assumed it was here in Glasnevin because the family, forget the name of the family, but they lived on Botanic Road, which is about a 5-minute walk from where I'm sitting now. And I was trying everything. I was trying to find them, see if the family anyway. I think the man himself, he was a worker on the ship and he actually died in the sinking. But the family, when they erected the headstone, mentioned his name, of course. And so they were looking for the headstone. And I was trying everything to try to find it. And it turns out that even though they lived 5 minutes away from the cemetery, they were actually buried in another cemetery on the south side of Dublin. Because while Glasnevin is non-denominational, it did have a reputation as being the Catholic cemetery of Dublin, while there's another one called Mount Jerome, which is also non-denominational, but had the reputation of being the Protestant cemetery. And so because the family were Protestant, that's where the family were buried. So I was very disappointed that I didn't have a Titanic story to share with people. But we do actually have an interesting connection, though. There was, you might be familiar with a guy called Father Francis Brown, who was a photographer, who took many famous photographs. He was a passenger on Titanic. He got on the ship at Southampton, where Titanic sailed to Cherbourg in France, and from Cherbourg to Cove, which was then known as Queenstown, in Ireland, before it set sail across the Atlantic. But his trip was limited to Southampton Cove. And so he took one of the final photographs of Titanic as it sailed off into the Atlantic. He befriended a wealthy American couple in first class who offered to pay the rest of his way to New York. He telegraphed his superiors back in Dublin requesting permission to stay on the ship. And the reply came back in all capital letters, no, get off that ship, because he was in the middle of his studies and so he wasn't allowed to extend his holiday. But that order ultimately saved his life. And so he got on a small tender ship in Cork Harbour and took one of the final photographs of Titanic as it sailed off. Must have been in a bad mood at the time, but ultimately a few days later, he found out that order saved his life. But he was some of his photographs were actually used when they were filming or when they were making the movie Titanic. Some of his photographs were actually used to ensure that the sets were as authentic as possible. Because he took dozens of photographs of Titanic while he was on the ship. So, he is an interesting story. He's buried not too far from where I am now. So there you are.
I love it, Ultan. Like, I can just sit here and you're just a wealth of information. And when I'm coming to Ireland, which I have to do, I'm looking you up because
good.
I tell you just have so many interesting stories. And it's really interesting too, just kind of back up a little bit, is to hear how meticulous your site has been with the records and all that information. And it kind of gets me thinking a little bit on, what is the future for commemoration when you're looking at, cemeteries and how things have done and how we're moving with technology. What is like some of the trends? What are some of the things you're thinking of and seeing when it comes to how we commemorate moving forward?
Well, it's an interesting question because we've just come out here in Ireland of what was called the Decade of Centenaries, from 1913 to 1923, during which it was really a transformative period here in Ireland. Of course, the 1916 Rising was fought, the First World War, of course, the War of Independence, which began in 1919, ended in 1921, and then the Irish Civil War from 1922 to 23. And so Glasnevin was really a focal point of commemorations here in Ireland, given the amount of people we have buried here. Although when it comes to, in terms of commemorations here now, it's pretty much, I wouldn't say it's a weekly occurrence, but certainly every 2 weeks we have commemoration, for example, of a Labour leader named James Larkin just a few weeks ago, for example, who was his anniversary. And so it wasn't a particularly, a big milestone for him, but still there was a huge amount of people who showed up, particularly those involved in the present Labour movement. But the thing about the cemeteries as well, although it does have that reputation of being an incredibly important place when it comes to the Irish struggle for independence against Britain, people of all backgrounds were buried here, including those who, fought with the British Army during there's a particular memorial not too far from where I am now, which commemorates those Irishmen who fought in the Boer War and the First and Second World Wars as well, many of whom are buried in the cemetery. And for quite a long time here in Ireland, the stories of those who, served during the Great War, for example, weren't really told. I think history focused on the Easter Rising and the War of Independence. But as I say, commemorations are held here quite a lot now, which is good, kind of sharing multifaceted, multiple narratives, I suppose, that can be told here in the cemetery, not just the one national, narrative of the country. In fact, we would get visiting dignitaries out here for Armistice Day each year, for example, in November. There's a big event for Bastille Day, for Memorial Day when it comes to people visiting from the US Embassy and the French Embassy as well. So we're certainly, quite a focal point for commemoration here in Ireland, Glasnevin.
Yeah, and with all that stuff happening, I imagine, it's a lot to keep track of, and that history that you're constantly commemorating, and I'm sure you're uncovering more all the time.
Yeah, that's a great thing about the cemetery. Yeah, always new stories. Yeah. There was a particular story I learned. I mean, I've been here 7 years now, more or less, and I walked right past a grave every single day, and it was only in the last few weeks. A guy named Austin Meldon, who was a famous doctor at the turn of the century, but he was also reputedly the first man in Ireland to own a bike. He began cycling in Paris in the 1860s, loved it so much that he bought a bike, brought it back on the ship to Dublin, and almost immediately established the country's first cycling club, even though he was the only person in Ireland with a bike, so he would have been a lonely member of that club. But he actually he married into the Pugin family. His father-in-law was Augustus Pugin, who designed the Houses of Parliament in London, including Big Ben. And again, this is a man whose grave I've been walking past for several years now, and it's only that little, story I heard quite recently. So I suppose 1.5 million stories. So you're bound to find new ones every now and then. Which is good.
Oh, I'd imagine. Yeah, all the time. Well, with stories and everything you have coming, what's next? What's on the horizon for your cemetery and your sites?
So I'd say what is coming up for us in terms of what's kind of looming on the horizon a little bit is the bicentenary of the establishment of the Dublin Cemeteries Trust. So of course that was 1828. So we'll be, kind of preparing for that coming up in 2028. There'll be quite a few events planned for Glasnevin Cemetery. It's still a bit up, in terms of what that will entail. I'm not sure yet. But it'll also involve kind of celebrating the history of Golden Bridge Cemetery, the sister cemetery to Glasnevin, but one with the kind of very interesting story as well, given that it's the first non-denominational cemetery in Ireland. So we'll be celebrating that, I suppose, and celebrating that kind of founding ideal that Daniel O'Connell had, that, there should be places for people to be laid to rest, people of all religions and none. So again, he was a very progressive man, a man before his time, I suppose, in many ways. So celebrating his legacy, I suppose, as we move into the next few years. We also have a couple of, big appeal here in Glasnevin Cemetery for the public is our guided tours, which are very, very popular. We're one of the top. It's odd describing the cemetery as a visitor attraction, but we're in the top 10 anyway on TripAdvisor for people to come out to the cemetery and do our guided tours. And the main one that we do is every day, kind of focuses on the likes of Daniel O'Connell and Michael Collins and those who shaped Irish history. But we also have a tour focusing on the women who shaped Irish history as well, many of whose stories were kind of overlooked, I suppose, in favor of the men. But the Women in History tour is one of our more popular tours as well. Which again, so many of the women buried here played very important roles in the struggle for Irish independence. One particular woman comes to mind named Margaret Skinner, who was a Scottish lady who was a school teacher, but she got caught up in the Easter Rising, and as a school teacher, she had a terrifying skill in that she was an amazing shot with a sniper rifle. So during the Easter Rising, she was in the middle of Dublin shooting up at the soldiers, and many, many decades later, she kind of dedicated her life to ensuring that women teachers were paid the same as men. But whenever she was in class and her kids wanted to interrupt the class, they would always ask, "Oh, Mrs. Skinner, tell us about how, the fighting during the Easter Rising and your skill with a sniper rifle." And she was always very happy to tell the kids how, skillful she was, I suppose. So a lot of very interesting stories of those buried here, which I quite like. And as I say, you're always learning more, which is great.
No kidding. I bet she had a pretty orderly classroom. No one misbehaving.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah. It's maybe slightly intimidating. Yeah.
Well, Ultan, this has been really, really good to just sit and listen. I can't believe the wealth of information and stories you have. Just hearing about the cemetery makes me want to book a ticket just to go see it itself. It's such a huge amount of history that you have the privilege of seeing almost every day. And I just really can hear that history of Ireland right there, and all of these, from the big monuments just down to the little monuments. So really, thank you so much for joining us today. And to our listeners, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please make sure to like and share and follow, and join us again for another podcast.